I don't need a husband to feed a ranch. Ruth Sutter said it plainly, the way she'd say the coffee was ready, or the biscuits were burning, standing in the doorway of the bar's cookhouse, with a ladle still in her hand, and 40 hungry men gone quiet behind her. She said it to Cornelius Prescott, the man who held her husband's note, in front of half the county at the Larkspur harvest supper. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away, and by the time the fiddle started up again, word of what she'd said, and what happened after it, was already halfway to Cheyenne. Because standing behind her, hat in his hands, was a cowhand nobody in 3 counties had ever thought to look at twice. Folks called him the giant cowboy, on account of his size and little else, on account of how quiet he kept. But before that night was through, he would prove to be the one man in Larkspur Hollow with the means and the reason to make certain Ruth Sutter never had to say that sentence to anyone again, not because she needed saving, but because he had never once believed she did. If you've ever stood somewhere and felt like the world had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, stay with this one. Hit subscribe if stories like Ruth's mean something to you. Drop the city you're watching from down in the comments, and stay until the end, because what happened in that hall is the kind of thing this whole territory still talks about. Now let's go back to Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, the spring before any of that happened. The Bar S sat at the widest bend of the Sweetwater Fork. 6,000 acres of graze and timber that Jedediah Sutter had built up over 15 years before a fever took him during the hard winter of 1883. He left it to Ruth outright, the land, the cattle, the debt, and the 40 men who worked it, and every one of them had privately expected her to sell within the year. She had not sold. By the time the frost broke that April, Ruth had run the cookhouse and the ledgers both for going on 16 months, rising before 4 to have coffee ready for the hands, portioning beef and beans and sourdough for 40 men 3 times a day, and keeping the account books in a hand steadier than her husband's had ever managed. She was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders and heavy through the hips and belly in the way of a woman who had spent half her life lifting cast-iron pots and hauling water and flour sacks that outweighed most men's pride. And if her arms had gone thick and her face had gone round and flushed from years at the stove, none of the men who ate her cooking ever seemed to hold it against her, not to her face anyway. Her mornings began the same way they had since the funeral. Coffee on the stove by 3:30, sourdough started the night before rising under a damp cloth, and the long iron skillet already hot by the time the first hand stumbled in rubbing sleep from his eyes. She fed 40 men on a widow's budget and a dead man's debt, and never once let either show in the portions. Amos Redfern, who had foremanned the Bar S under Jedediah for 6 years and had half expected to be foremanning it for some new owner by now, had taken to settling any grumbling among the younger hands with a single flat sentence, that he'd worked for outfits twice this size with cooks half as good and books kept twice as poor, and any man who didn't care for Mrs. Sutter's arrangement of things was welcome to draw his pay and ride on. Few ever took him up on it. The beef was honest, the biscuits were plentiful, and the woman who served them did the branding tally herself every spring without once losing a calf to bad arithmetic. The note itself she kept folded inside the household ledger, in an envelope gone soft at the creases from handling. It was Jedediah's signature at the bottom of it, and the Cheyenne Bank's seal above that, and every month she carried the interest payment into town herself rather than trust it to the mail, because a woman who let a debt go unwatched, she'd learned, was a woman inviting someone else to watch it for her. It was in town that the trouble started. She'd gone in for flour and salt pork and found herself standing at the counter of Whitcomb's Mercantile while 2 drovers behind her in line talked just loud enough to be sure she heard them. A widow woman running 40 head and a bunkhouse full of men, one of them said, not quite looking at her. Wonder how long before the bank just takes it clean out from under her. Wonder how long before some fella takes pity and takes her instead. The other one laughed, and there was no unkindness sharp enough to make Ruth flinch outwardly. She paid Mr. Whitcomb, thanked him, and carried the sack out to her wagon with both hands steady, and if there was a tightness behind her ribs on the ride home, she did not let it show on her face, and she did not cry. She had learned, in 16 months, that there was no profit in it. She was still turning it over, not with tears, but with the particular tired anger of a woman doing arithmetic she resented, when she came up the long drive to the Bar S and saw a stranger at her corral fence, so tall he had to duck under the top rail to check a colt's foreleg, shoulders like a doorway, patient enough with the frightened animal that it had stopped trembling by the time she pulled up. "You lost?" she asked, because it seemed the safer question. "Looking for work," he said, straightening slow so as not to spook anything. "Name's Boone. Heard in town you were a hand short for branding." She was 3 hands short, in truth, and knew it, and she looked him over the way she'd learned to look over everything that came onto her land now, for cost, for risk, for what it would take from her later. He didn't flinch under it. Didn't smile too wide or offer his hand too fast, the way men did when they had something to sell her, whether feed or sympathy or themselves. "$1 a day and you're bored," she said. "You work, you eat. You don't, you don't." "Suits me," Boone said, and that was the whole of it. Larkspur Hollow itself was not a large town. A mercantile, a bank, a church that doubled as a dance hall come harvest, and a scatter of ranches strung out along the Sweetwater Fork that all knew one another's business better than they knew their own. But it was large enough that a widow running cattle alone could not so much as buy flour without the whole valley hearing of it by supper. Spring gave way to a wet, green early summer that year, the kind that fattened calves and swelled the creek and kept every hand on the barse working from before light until well past dark, and in all that work Boone Kincaid proved himself steady in a way that made even Amos Redfern, no easy man to satisfy, stop watching him for the trouble a drifter usually brought and start simply counting on him instead. He signed nothing but his first name in the bunkhouse ledger, gave no ranch of origin, no family, no direction he'd come from or was headed. Foreman Amos Redfern shrugged it off the way he shrugged off most drifters. A man's rope work and his branding iron told you what you needed to know, and Boone's told plenty. He worked from can-see to can't, ate what was put in front of him without complaint, and by the second week, the other hands had stopped noticing his silence and started noticing that the horses which had thrown 3 other men that spring stood easy for him. Ruth noticed something else. At supper that first Saturday, when the last plate had been scraped and the men had scattered to the bunkhouse or the porch to smoke, she came back into the cookhouse to bank the stove and found the door hinge, which had squealed and dropped half an inch on its pin since before Jedediah died, sitting fixed, oiled, and true, with Boone already halfway to the bunkhouse in the dark. "Anything else needs fixing before I go?" he'd said over his shoulder, not stopping. She hadn't asked him to. She said nothing that night, only stood in the doorway a moment with her hand on the hinge, testing how quiet it swung now, before she went back to her books. That was how it started, though neither of them called it anything for a long while. The ledgers on one side of the cookhouse table, the note from Prescott's bank folded inside them, where she looked at the figure every night, and every night it looked back the same, and on the other side of the table, once a week, whatever Boone Kincaid had quietly mended without being asked. It became a habit before it became a ritual, and a ritual before either of them would have named it courting. Every Saturday, after the hands had eaten and drifted off, Boone stayed behind 10 minutes, sometimes 20, and fixed one broken thing about the cookhouse or the smokehouse or the well pump. A cracked table leg shimmed true, a chimney damper freed of rust, a busted latch on the flour bin replaced with one he'd whittled and fitted himself. He never asked permission and never took credit. He only asked, each time, the same 6 words and left before she could thank him properly. Ruth began, without quite deciding to, leaving her ledgers open on the table those evenings instead of carrying them off to her room. She told herself it was because the lamp was better there. She did not examine it further than that. Some Saturdays the mending was small, a bent spoon straightened, a cracked crock reglued with pitch, the woodpile restacked so the wet logs sat where the stove's heat would find them first. Other weeks it was larger. The well pump seized entirely one July, and every hand on the place had taken a turn at it and pronounced it dead before Boone spent the better part of a night stripping it down by lantern light and setting it right by the time the coffee went on. He never mentioned it the next morning, and Ruth only knew because she'd watched the water come up clear and easy where it had wheezed and spat for a week. There came a night in early August when 3 of the young steers went off their feed and stood hunched and miserable in the north pasture, and half the crew was ready to call it blackleg and start digging. Ruth walked out with a lantern herself past midnight, Boone beside her without being asked, and between the two of them, her reading the animals' eyes and gums the way she read a column of figures, him reading their gait and the state of the grass they'd been run on, they settled on foul water from a silted-up spring rather than disease, moved the herd before dawn, and lost not one head. Riding back to the house as the sky went gray, neither of them spoke of anything but cattle, and both of them understood, without a word passing between them on the matter, that it had been the finest conversation either had had in a year. "You've a good eye for stock," Boone told her once, watching her cull a lame heifer from the herd before the animal had even fully favored the leg. "Better than most men I've paid wages to." "Jedediah used to say the same," Ruth said, though he generally said it like it surprised him. "You don't say it like that." "No," Boone agreed, and offered nothing further, and she found she did not need him to. Their conversation, when it came sideways, the way conversation does between two people neither of them was fool enough to call idle. She asked him once, watching him true up a warped floorboard, whether he'd worked cattle his whole life. He said he'd worked plenty of things his whole life, cattle among them, and offered nothing more. She let it lie. In turn, when he asked why she kept the ledgers herself instead of hiring a man from town to do the figuring, she told him plainly that she'd rather trust her own arithmetic than any man's kindness, and he'd nodded once, like that answer satisfied something in him she hadn't meant to reveal. Their real language, though, was work, and both of them spoke it fluently. She could tell him the cost of feeding a branding crew for a week, down to the pound of salt, and he'd listen the way other men listened to Scripture. He could tell her which of her steers would winter poorly and why, reading a coat and a gait the way she read a column of figures, and she found herself, some evenings, waiting on his opinion of the herd, the way she'd once waited on Jedediah's, though she would not have said so aloud to a living soul. By the time the branding was done and the calves were bawling in the spring pastures, Boone Kincaid had been at the Bar S 2 months, and Ruth Sutter had stopped counting the days until he'd move on, the way drifters always did, and started noticing instead how much quieter the cookhouse felt on the one Saturday he'd ridden into Larkspur for supplies and hadn't been there to fix a single hinge. It was in Larkspur, on one of his supply trips, that Boone first heard the name Cornelius Prescott, spoken with the particular flatness men use for a man they fear and won't admit to fearing. Prescott ran the Larkspur Trust and Cattle Bank, wore his suits pressed even in August, and had a way of speaking to widows and small ranchers alike that made every sentence sound like a kindness he was doing them a favor to extend. "Man's bought up half the small notes in this valley these last 2 years," Amos told him, low over the branding fire one evening, not knowing Boone had already heard the name and filed it away. Waits till a fella's a season behind on something, then buys the debt off whichever bank's tired of carrying it, cheap. Calls it due whenever it suits him best. Took the Hendersons' place that way 2 winters back, and old man Whitfield's south section the winter after. Mrs. Sutter's note's been quiet a year, but I don't like how often Prescott's driven out this way of late, asking after her health like he's got a stake in it. He does, Boone said, and did not explain what he meant by it, and rode into Larkspur alone the following week on an errand he told no one about, not even Ruth. He came out to the Barseds himself that same week, driving a fine trap and dressed for a call rather than for business, though business was plainly all he'd come for. Ruth received him on the porch rather than in the house, poured him coffee she did not sit down to share, and let him say his piece standing. Mrs. Sutter. He turned his hat in his hands with a courtesy that never once reached his eyes. I've come as a friend of Jedediah's, not merely his creditor, and I hope you'll receive what I have to say in that spirit. I generally find it's one or the other, Mr. Prescott, Ruth said. Say your piece. He smiled at that, the way a man smiles at a child's cleverness. A woman minding 40 head and a bunkhouse full of hands, bless her heart, is a heavier load than most would ever ask a lady to bear alone. You've managed adequately, I'll grant you, further than most expected. But pride is a poor collateral, Mrs. Sutter, and I'd be a poor friend if I let you carry that debt into another winter without a plan more certain than good intentions. I have a plan, she said. It's called the Fall Drive. The Fall Drive is 4 months distant, Prescott said, gentler now, which was worse. My associate, Mr. Bramwell, has expressed a sincere admiration for you and for what you've built here. A marriage to a man of means would settle Jedediah's note within the week, and settle a great many other uncertainties besides. I only ask that you consider it before pride costs you more than you mean to pay. Ruth set his coffee cup down on the porch rail hard enough that he startled. I'll consider the Fall Drive, Mr. Prescott, she said. You may tell Mr. Bramwell I'm obliged for the sincere admiration and unavailable to receive it. He left smiling still, which troubled her more than if he'd left angry, and it was 2 weeks later, in a letter delivered by his own bank clerk rather than the postal rider, that Ruth understood why. The letter cited a clause in Jedediah's original note, one she had read a dozen times and never once seen the way Prescott's lawyer had chosen to read it now, permitting the bank to call the full balance due within 60 days should the holder deem the collateral, quote, insufficiently secured. Prescott had, the letter informed her with regret, recently acquired the note in full from the Cheyenne Bank that originally held it, and found himself, regrettably, obliged by his fiduciary duty to exercise the clause. 60 days, 4 months short of the Fall Drive, and every dollar of it. 60 days was not merely a season short of the drive, it was every hand's winter wages, every widow's promise she'd made herself the night she buried Jedediah, and the only thing she had left of the 15 years he'd spent building the place stone by stone and fence post by fence post. She thought of the men asleep in the bunkhouse who'd trust her to keep paying them through the winter regardless of what the bank decided, and of her own name on a deed that had never once, in 16 months, felt like anything but a debt she owed the dead as much as the living. She read the letter twice at the cookhouse table, alone, the lamp burned low, and did not cry. She had learned there was no profit in it. What she did instead was take out a fresh sheet of ledger paper and begin, in her steady hand, to calculate exactly how far short of 60 days' worth of money the Bar S truly stood, which was the whole of it, every dollar, with nothing to spare and no bank in 3 counties fool enough to loan against a note already called. She spent the better part of the next week riding to every bank within a day's reach of Larkspur Hollow, and found the same answer waiting at each one, sympathetic, regretful, and final. No institution in the territory would extend fresh credit against a note another bank had already called. It was, they told her, simply not how the arithmetic of risk was done, whatever they privately thought of Prescott's methods. She drove home from the last of them, in Cheyenne, with the wagon empty and her jaw set, and did not once let the men riding escort see anything but a woman tired from a long errand. Boone found her at the cookhouse table past midnight the night she returned, the lamp guttering, the letter spread before her alongside a fresh sheet of figures that solved nothing. He read the letter through twice without asking, set it down, and asked her only one question. "What do you aim to do?" "Feed a ranch," Ruth said. "The same as I've done every day since Jedediah died. I don't aim to marry a stranger to keep doing it, if that's what you're asking." "Wasn't asking that," Boone said, and something in his voice made her look up at him properly for the first time that night, though she couldn't have said afterward what it was she'd seen there. "I could lend you the sum myself," he said after a moment. "Wouldn't miss it." "No," Ruth said, before he'd finished saying it, and there was no unkindness in the refusal, only certainty. "I'll take a fixed hand for $1 a day, same as any other, Boone Kincaid, and I'll take a fixed hinge on a Saturday, because you've never once asked my leave to give it. But I won't take a man's charity dressed up as courting, not from you, not from anybody. If I lose this ranch, I'll lose it standing on my own arithmetic, not owing it to a man's pity." "Wasn't offering pity," Boone said. "I know it," Ruth said, gentler. "That's why I'm telling you no plain, instead of politely." He nodded slow, like a man filing away information he intended to make use of later, and said nothing further on the matter that night, though he rode into Larkspur alone again 3 days after, on an errand he still told no one about. Word of the called note moved through Larkspur the way such things always did, faster than truth and twice as unkind, and by the time the town gathered for the harvest supper that September, half the county believed the Bar S as good as sold, and the other half was taking wagers on who Ruth Sutter would marry to save it, Mr. Bramwell's name spoken oftenest of all. The harvest supper was the one occasion each year when every ranch family and every townsperson in the hollow crowded under the same roof, and this year the crowding had the particular electric hush of an audience that suspected it was about to witness something worth the retelling. Long tables had been dragged to the walls, and the church hall's floor swept for dancing, and Ruth arrived in her good gray dress with her sleeves rolled to serve, because she had told Amos plainly that she would not sit idle at her own supper, pretending nothing hung over her head. And the crew of the Bar S, every hand who'd eaten her cooking that spring and summer, had arrived early and taken the benches nearest the front, a wall of quiet loyalty that even Cornelius Prescott, arriving in his pressed suit with Mr. Bramwell trailing at his elbow, could not fail to notice and did not trouble to acknowledge. Cornelius Prescott had arranged, with the particular patience of a man who enjoyed an audience, to make his announcement of the foreclosure at the supper itself, before the whole assembled county, dressed in his best suit and carrying Jedediah's note folded in his breast pocket, like a trump card he'd been saving. He rose during the lull between supper and dancing, tapped his glass, and spoke with great and public sorrow of a widow's hardship and a bank's regrettable obligations, and offered, with equal public generosity, one final avenue of mercy. Mr. Bramwell stood ready, this very evening, to make Mrs. Sutter an offer of marriage that would settle the note in full and spare her the indignity of the auction block. The hall had gone very quiet, the way a room goes quiet when it senses it is about to witness something it will repeat for years. Ruth stood up from her bench with her ladle still in one hand from serving, because she had not stopped working even at her own supper, and walked to where Prescott stood, and the whole county watched her do it. "Mr. Prescott," she said, and her voice did not shake, "I have fed this ranch's crew 3 times a day for 16 months with these 2 hands. I have kept its books, doctored its stock, and buried its owner without once asking a soul in this hall for pity, though plenty of you offered it whether I asked or no. I don't need a husband to feed a ranch. I never have. If the note comes due, I'll meet it as I've met every hard thing since Jedediah passed, myself, and on my own 2 feet. A murmur went through the crowd, some admiring, some scandalized, Mr. Bramwell's ears going red where he stood by the punch bowl. Somewhere near the front, one of the drovers who'd laughed at her in the mercantile that spring found a great deal of sudden interest in the floorboards. Prescott's smile did not waver, because he believed, quite correctly, that a woman's pride could not pay a note that pride alone had never earned, and he let the silence stretch a moment longer before he answered her, the way a man does when he still believes the room belongs to him. "Admirable sentiment, Mrs. Sutter," he said, loud enough for the whole hall, "but sentiment does not settle 60 days' obligation. I regret that, without the sum in full, or a marriage to secure it, the bar cess must—" "The note's already settled, Mr. Prescott." It was Boone who said it, rising from the bench behind her, where he'd sat unremarked all evening in his one good shirt, and every head in the hall turned to look at a man most of them had never troubled to notice twice. "Bought it myself, 3 weeks back, off the Cheyenne Bank's own books, before you'd finished walking your lawyer through that clause you like so well," Boone said, drawing a folded paper from his coat and laying it on the table beside Prescott's, "which means the note answers to me now. And I've no intention of calling it early, or calling it at all, provided the Bar S keeps running the way it's been run, which is to say, better than most outfits in this territory manage with twice the hands and half the sense." Prescott's mouth opened and found nothing in it. "And who," he managed, "are you to be buying notes of that size?" "Boone Kincaid," Boone said, and let that land the way he'd let nothing land in 2 months at the Bar Cess. "Kincaid Cattle Company, 3 counties west. Reckon some of you've shipped beef through my rail spur without ever asking whose name was on the deed." The silence that followed was of an entirely different order than the one before it. Kincaid Cattle Company ran more head than any 3 outfits in the territory combined, and every man in that hall who'd ever cursed a rail spur's shipping fee understood, in the space of one breath, exactly whose pocket those fees had lined. Amos Redfern, standing among the Bar S hands at the front bench, let out a low whistle he didn't trouble to hide, and even Mr. Bramwell, red-eared and forgotten by the punch bowl, had the grace to look relieved rather than slighted. Prescott recovered himself enough to reach for bluster. "This is highly irregular," he said. "A note transferred without proper notice to this bank." "Notice was filed proper, through the Territorial Land Office, same as any note," Boone said, unhurried. "You'd have seen it yourself, Mr. Prescott, if you'd spent less time this month arranging suppers and more time reading your own correspondence. I'd be obliged if you'd leave the arithmetic of the Bar S to the man holding its paper from here on, and leave Mrs. Sutter to hers." Prescott looked once around the hall, at 40 faces that had gone from wary to openly unsympathetic in the space of a few minutes, gathered up what remained of his dignity along with Mr. Bramwell by the sleeve, and departed the harvest supper considerably earlier than he had planned to. Ruth turned to look at him, ladle still forgotten in her hand, and for the first time that whole long evening she did not have a ready word. "You might have told me," she said, quiet enough that it was only for him. "Wasn't the telling that mattered," Boone said. "Was whether it changed anything you'd done, or anything I thought of you for doing it. It didn't. Figured that was worth more than the name." He crossed the last few feet of floor between them, in front of the whole hushed hall, and did not kneel, because Ruth Sutter had never once asked a man to kneel to prove himself. "I've watched you feed 40 men 3 meals a day and keep books straighter than any banker in this room," he said, bury a husband without asking a soul to carry it for you, and stand up in front of this whole county tonight and tell the truth plain when a lie would have bought you an easier winter. I've fixed every broken hinge and busted table leg on that place these 2 months looking for an excuse to stay another Saturday, and I'm done pretending it was the hinges. I'm not asking you to marry a rich man, Ruth. I'm asking you to marry the same hand that's been fixing your cookhouse door, because he can't think of a better use for the rest of his life than standing beside a woman who never once needed him to. The hall that had gone quiet for Prescott's humiliation went quieter still for this, and somewhere near the back, a woman who'd laughed at Ruth not 3 months prior was seen to press a handkerchief to her own eyes. The hall waited on her answer, the way it had waited on nothing else all evening, 40 of her own hands among them holding a collective breath they'd have denied holding if asked. Ruth looked at him a long moment, at the man who had signed nothing but a first name and mended what nobody asked him to mend, and set her ladle down on the table at last. "I still don't need a husband to feed a ranch," she said, and something in her voice had gone warm where it had been steady before. "But I wouldn't mind the company while I do it." "That'll do," Boone said, and the hall broke into a noise that took a full minute for the fiddler to talk over. They were married 3 weeks later in the same hall, plain as either of them wanted it. No lace beyond what Ruth had trimmed herself onto a dress she'd sewn in the evenings after the ledgers were closed. No guest list beyond the whole of Larkspur Hollow, who came anyway and stayed till the lamps burned down. Amos Redfern stood as witness and pronounced it, gruffly, the finest arrangement he'd foremanned in 20 years of ranching. The Bar S hands roasted a steer in the yard the next morning and toasted the new brand that would go on the gate before the month was out, and if anyone in the county still doubted whether a widow could hold a ranch on her own arithmetic, they kept it to themselves from that day forward. Cornelius Prescott did not attend, and left the territory within the year for reasons the town discussed for considerably longer than his absence merited. Mr. Bramwell married a rancher's daughter from Cheyenne the following spring, and was, by all reports, tolerably content. 5 years on, the sign at the end of the long drive read Sutter Kincaid Cattle Co., and the cookhouse Ruth had once run alone had grown a second stove, a second table, and a standing arrangement that any woman in the county turned away from honest work elsewhere was welcome to a place at it, no questions asked beyond whether she could learn. That was how Etta Bowman came to the Bar S that autumn, 17 and recently orphaned, having been turned off 3 ranches in a row for reasons no one troubled to explain to a girl nobody thought worth explaining anything to. Ruth found her sitting on the mercantile steps in Larkspur with a single carpet bag and put her to work in the cookhouse before the girl had finished stammering her thanks, the same way Boone had once found work for a stranger at a corral fence, without asking where he'd come from. "You'll learn the books too, not just the stove," Ruth told her that first week, setting a fresh ledger down on the same table where a folded note had once decided everything and decided nothing at all. A woman who can feed a ranch and figure its accounts never has to wait on anybody's permission to be worth something. Etta was clumsy with the flour bin those first weeks, and clumsier still with the columns of figures, and more than one hand at supper wondered aloud, within easy earshot, whether the girl would ever amount to much use. Ruth answered that the way she answered most things now, by handing Etta the ledger again the next morning and standing over her shoulder until the arithmetic came right, and by the time the following spring's branding tally was done, it was Etta's steady hand that had kept it, without a single calf lost to bad figuring. Boone, for his part, never did stop fixing things on a Saturday evening, though there was little enough left on the Bar S in want of mending by then, and the hands had long since taken to teasing him gently about it. He fixed the smokehouse latch a second time the year it finally gave out for good, and when Ruth asked him once, lightly, whether he meant to go on doing it forever, he told her he supposed he would, seeing as it was the only courting he'd ever known that had actually worked. Etta Bowman kept that ledger for 6 years before she married a rancher's son and took over an outfit of her own 2 valleys south, and she was known, by then, to say much the same thing to every overlooked girl who crossed her own kitchen door, in words she'd first heard at a scarred cookhouse table from a woman who had never once needed rescuing to be worth the saving of. Folks in Larkspur Hollow still tell it the way they told it that first September. The widow who fed 40 men and never once cried where anyone could see it, and the giant cowboy who fixed her hinges for 2 months before he ever fixed his eyes on her plane. But the part they get right, more often than not, is the part Ruth herself insisted on whenever anyone asked. Nobody had to give her a ranch, or a husband, or a name to make her worth noticing. She had already been all three, quietly. Every single day, nobody was watching. The company, when it came, was simply the part she'd decided, at last, that she wanted.